upstairs in my house. I had my feet up against the base of a screen hanging from the ceiling. It was weighted down at the bottom. And on the screen, there was this woman. She was being tied to a pair of poles, and she was screaming and thrashing about. And I was scared for her. I didn't know what was going on. There was this thump sort of sound, and trees started breaking. Then all of a sudden, it was calm. I don't remember walking. I don't remember my parents' faces out of the crib. I remember Kong. That's what stuck.
I got started in film criticism. I worked at the public radio station in Detroit. They needed a film critic. I was in school. I said, I'll do it. Okay, great, you can do it. And the idea of going to movies for free, it was like the express train to heaven. What are you kidding? No stops.
I look at movies in my spare time. I look at DVDs and Laserdiscs at home because I love movies. I have no idea how many movies I've seen, thousands of movies.
We inhabit a film-crazy universe, a world taken over by the movies. These crowds to watch a film could be anywhere on Earth. People lined up to see a favorite art film, a Hollywood blockbuster, an admired director and stars.
The one common factor that everyone has, whether he's a peasant in Bolivia or the Pope in the Vatican, is that in some way film has touched him. In some way.
For a few people, film has a different, perhaps deeper meaning. It's their profession to get to a movie. And they respond to cinema as a personal crusade and calling.
I live for discovery. I live for finding somebody, putting it all together in a new way.
If I can see 3 movies this weekend, why should I just see one? I am a junkie. If movies could kill you, I would have been dead years ago.
They are the film critics.
Emily from Montmartre is this utterly delightful film.
I absolutely hated Amelie.
It's exactly the sort of film people are nostalgic for. She's just so lovely, and everything that happens to her is just so lovely.
The job of a film critic is to expand the movie and to inform a reader about what more it is than just a movie.
Now, what's smart about it is that it knows that nostalgia. It's not oblivious to it. It's very consciously reworking all of these beloved tropes from French cinema.
It's celebrated for being life-affirming and very human. And in fact, it has no human dimensions. I mean, all the characters have just one trait. It's like a cartoon.
Criticism ultimately is about your relationship to this work, your relationship to the world, this work's relationship to the world, this work's relationship to other works. It's about all these shifting ways of being in the world. That's what criticism is about. It's about thinking.
Those who review pass unnoticed in the crowds, perhaps as it should be. But would criticism be more valued if their faces and voices were known, and their backstory and history? A 100 years ago, silent movies played everywhere in America. Sad ones and funny ones. very odd ones. But you were on your own choosing among them. The profession of film critic hadn't been invented. All that changed around 1907, a decade after the birth of cinema. Trade papers assigned writers to comment on this newly popular mass entertainment. The first critiques were little more than plot synopses, written by general reporters to coax advertising from the new motion picture companies.
The earliest criticism was written by people who had not grown up in an era of film. They were discovering film, so to speak, as they were writing about it.
Were movies nothing more than filmed theater? Or were they a vastly different kind of medium, going where theater never ventured? What should be talked about in a movie review? One writer developed a point of view. Frank E. Woods, a columnist at the New York Dramatic Mirror.
Woods was arguably the first movie reviewer in America. Movies at that point were really just novelties. He did have a kind of a vision that movies might be more than a 10 or 11 minute reel. They had the potential for being art.
He focused his articles on movie acting, lecturing that it should be more subdued and subtle than live theater. He studied the 1- and 2-reelers coming out of Biograph Pictures and wrote in praise of those directed by D.W. Griffith.
It is not the personality of particular players that makes for success. First, it's the story. Second, the direction.
Woods was the first critic to go to work for the very people he reviewed. He would join Griffith and Company in a dramatic move, from New York to Hollywood. Few realized that Griffith's 1915 epic was co-written by a film critic.
He talked it up. This is a great work, you know, this is a huge thing that we're doing. It's unprecedented in American film, all that. So probably the beginnings of the buzz about Birth began with Frank Woods at some cafe in Los Angeles as they were shooting. Woods invested a fair amount of money in Los Angeles real estate, became rather rich. By the early 20s, he was gone from Griffith's life and gone from the movies.
Into the film world came Beta Lindsay, who wrote what is really the first serious book about film in this country, called The Art of the Moving Picture. It was published in 1915.
Lindsay was a poet smitten by the cinema. Among his verse were paeans to movie stars. There was an unhidden crush on Mary Pickford, whose films he watched again and again. Lindsay compared Little Mary to a Botticelli. Painting in motion, he called film, poetry of the eye, as in this adaptation of a Poe short story, which he admired.
He saw something that others saw too, but he saw it more keenly and more memorably, and he wrote about it, that the arrival of film was a key moment in the history of human consciousness. That it was going to change the way people thought, dreamed, fantasized, the way they shaped their inner selves.
The person who defined the beat of a modern film critic was Robert Sherwood. In 1920, the 25-year-old started a decade of weekly reviews for Life, a New York humor magazine. The 1920s were a time of prosperity, nowhere more than in a booming Hollywood. Sherwood's playful, upbeat voice was in tune with filmdom's spirit and energy.
Buster Keaton has helped to keep the much-molested human race in good humor. At a time when it has nothing to think about but high taxes, United States senators, banana shortages, and Signor Mussolini.
He was a real movie fan. He was kind of a genial reviewer, kind of a good-natured reviewer.
For the first time with Sherwood, Hollywood actively courted a film critic. He left New York on a cross-country train and visited the studios as their guest. His wedding showed off his media power. It was attended not only by Scott and Zelda Fitzgerald, but by filmdom's royal couple, Douglas Fairbanks and Mary Pickford.
He then went on to become, I think, the man who won more Pulitzer Prizes than any single individual in American history. I mean, for his plays and for this biography of Roosevelt and Hopkins. He actually wrote The Best Years of Our Lives. That's a movie.
The screenplay was written by Robert E. Sherwood, Pulitzer Prize-winning playwright of Petrified Forest and Idiot's Delight.
Sherwood was the first film critic to taste fame and glory. But he'd reviewed in the 1920s for a more modest reason. He really enjoyed going to the movies.
For the self-conscious highbrows who know nothing about motion pictures, I have no respect whatsoever. I should go to the movies, even if I were not paid to do so.
I've sometimes been accused around my magazine of having an unhealthy attraction to dark, disturbing, edgy movies, and it's probably true. I think that may go back to an experience I had where my parents used to take me and my brothers to drive-ins in the late 60s, and I remember I saw Rosemary's Baby when I was 9 years old. Ruth Gordon really freaked me out in that movie.
Oh, you pregnant?
No, not yet.
Yeah, I mean, with that little whiny voice.
Wonderful, were you? Young and healthy.
And she was so sort of banal, just the old lady next door, and then she turns out to be this devil worshiper.
He chose you out of all the world, out of all the women in the whole world. He chose you. He arranged them.
Movies seem to be about this forbidden world of mystery, and I wanted to see more of it. And I wanted to figure out why it affected me so much. That was probably the birth of why I became a movie critic.
I think everybody thinks they're a film critic. What actually qualifies to be a film critic, at least professionally, is that somebody will pay you to do it. You know, there actually is no real qualification. You know, there's no degree you'll get.
My qualification is that I'm more of a nice person than a nasty person on a good day, and I know a little bit about how movies were put together, and I've seen an awful lot of them.
There's no diploma or credential or license or union card. I guess what qualifies me is that I always loved movies and especially loved arguing about them after I'd seen them.
Why are you not playing first base and Jason Giambi is? Or why are you not playing shortstop and Derek Jeter is? He got the job. I got the job.
Didn't go to pictures in the 30s and 40s, the great studio era. But what movie to see? Most Americans had a simple need for a review. They checked a family newspaper to see what actors were in it, and did it sound entertaining? Newspapers, loads of them, competed in every city. Audiences could pick and choose among all kinds of film critics.
In those days, criticism was clearly divided into two kinds. One was popular general criticism, written by very pleasant people who were members of the audience, so to speak.
In New York, many opted in the 30s and 40s for populist Kate Cameron in the Daily News, famous for her straightforward rhetoric and the star system of rating movies.
The other group was the intellectual writers, equipped, cultivated people who were writing for small circulation magazines.
Open a tiny periodical, and you'd find an unusual critic voice.
I first saw Storm Over Asia intact in Amsterdam. I've seen it 3 times since. My reaction has always been the same. An exciting film which beats any American audience film. It makes the boasted dramatic technique of America appear a schoolboy's exercise.
Some saw cinema as a high modernist art form. They praised European masters such as Murnau, Dreyer, and Pudovkin. Others dipped into the American vernacular. They wrote of Hollywood in the hard-boiled, cynical language of Chandler and Hammett.
The critic of the late 30s that I've always liked the best was a guy named Otis Ferguson, who wrote The New Republic.
He's one of the first critics to actually speak in sort of a people's language about movies. He's just really entertaining. Pretty much everything he wrote was sharp and it was incisive.
Ferguson's language was lean and tough, in praise of fast-paced genre films.
A ring champ gets implicated in a murder and blows town, and shows up on a sort of boys' town date ranch. There's a gal on the ranch who has all the little toughies nailed and hates evil like anything.
Mind your own business, will you?
Generally, the film holds together enough to make some nice, fast watching.
He went to war in the Merchant Marine and was killed very early. And it was a kind of a great career that was cut off by the tragedy of World War II.
Otis Ferguson, he was very patriotic, and the job was open for about 14 seconds. And I phoned up the New Republic and said, now you've got a new movie critic. And
Manny Farber became criticism's most renowned stylist, his words sparked by jazz and modern painting.
Farber writes nothing that could be considered standard English. Everything is shoot-the-shoots and funhouse mirrors in his prose. Everything seems to have been cobbled together syntactically, lexically.
I circumvented writing about the story and the plot, and I dived into the center of the movie. I felt if I could describe something, a gesture, or an action, or a scene, or a piece of art, of scenery, I was on safe ground.
Like Otis Ferguson, Farber wrote with special flavor about low-budget crime melodramas, what he called termite art.
Come on, take it off. I don't like games.
The best action films are slicing journeys into the lower depths of American life. Dregs, outcasts, lonely hard wanderers caught in a buzzsaw.
What makes a two-bit heel like you think a heater would give him an edge over me?
With material that is hopelessly worn out, the underground director becomes beautifully graphic.
What's waiting for you, Harris? The chair, the gas chamber, or just a rope?
The best thing that can be said of a critic, that what they write is so singular and interesting that you can't turn it into advertising. With Manny, you can't even tell sometimes whether he likes the movie or hates it. Doesn't matter.
The Southerner tries simply to be a poetic, realistic chronicle of a farm year's hope, work, need, anxiety, pride, love, disaster, and reward. It is a chronicle chiefly of soil, seasons, and weather. It is one of the most sensitive and beautiful American-made films I've seen.
Every film critic who thinks about the history of what we do and the great figures of the past has to think about James Agee, who was really just the first great American movie critic. And he didn't invent it, but showed that what it could be as a form of journalism and a form of literature and a way of talking about the world.
He reviewed for both Time magazine and The Nation, aligning highbrow and popular taste. In 1949, Agee wrote for Life magazine his most celebrated article, Comedy's Greatest Era, an homage to the slapstick comedies of years gone by.
His famous essay on the comic mind, and Laurel and Hardy taking the piano across the rope bridge when they meet a gorilla.
I see a monkey. A what? A monkey.
It's a kind of X-ray of the human sense of humor and the gorilla sense of humor.
Ahead of other American critics, he credited the movies he most admired to the personality behind the camera. The best films were personal ones, made by forceful directors. Meanwhile, back at daily papers, where was the New York Times in all of this? In 1940, the Times promoted a young reporter whose words and reviews would have real impact.
Representing 18 daily newspaper film critics is their president, Bosley Crowther, popular critic of the New York Times.
Katharine Hepburn is back in Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer's production of the Philadelphia Story. And for it, the New York film critics are indeed happy to make this award for the best performance by an actress in 1940.
If Mr. Crowther and the New York critics don't know how hysterically happy I am to be chosen their Girl of the Year, they're crazy.
Bosley Crowther was, 25 years, was the big authority on film in New York and everywhere. He influenced Hollywood, too. He influenced the Oscars and everything.
He was a very lively and entertaining writer. Some of his turns of phrase are kind of absurdly wonderful. There's some John Ford movie that he reviews, which he refers to as a dilly of a cavalry picture. I could never write that sentence, but I kind of wish that I could.
Crowther was a booster for subtitle foreign films, coming from France, India, Italy, Japan. But best were Crowther's sustained attacks on movie censorship, McCarthyism, the blacklist.
He was a good Democrat, a good liberal. He supported the right causes, and when those were embodied in film, so much the better.
On the other hand, Crowther looked past B-genre movies. He had little feel for cynical film noirs.
Go!
For Crowther, a moral theme, anti-fascism, anti-prejudice, was far more important than cinematic style or direction. He reigned at the Times for 20 years before his aesthetics were challenged by young Turk film critics, including Andrew Sarris and Pauline Kael.
Pauline and Andy and I looked at movies in a kind of an amoral way. You know, I mean, we just wanted to see aesthetically what that movie was doing or not doing. And we didn't give a raps about, you know, what its effect was on the morals of a 12-year-old who happened to see it. We were just movie people.
Diabolique was the first French film I ever saw. Well, first of all, it was set in this school, and I went to a girls' school, and you had Simone Signoret and Vera Clouzot skulking around, having some sort of strange relationship. That sort of vaguely reminded me of some of the teachers in the girls' school. And then the bathtub scene, which was the most terrifying, even after seeing Psycho or everything else. When you think someone's dead, and then they rise. When Paul Maurice rose. And I screamed, everyone in the audience screamed. I knew then, if I hadn't known before, the totally convulsive effect of the immediacy of movies.
In France in the 1950s, young critics around the film magazine Cahiers du Cinéma were coming up with the same approach as Agee. They built a philosophy around it, the so-called auteur theory.
The auteur theory states that the director is the guiding intelligence, the guiding spirit, the person who determines what the film is going to be like. And that you can see a through line through all his work, no matter who the writer is, no matter who the cinematographer is, no matter who the actors are, that the director's spirit overwhelms everything else.
The director not only matters, but matters more than just about everything else that might go into the movie, such as the screenplay, the lighting, the actors, and the words they say.
Andrew Sarris became enamored of the French idea that a film director can be as much an artist as a painter or a novelist.
I love French culture and French criticism. It's often crazy, often off the wall, but it's always entertaining.
He reads French, he happens upon the Cahiers crowd and their writings and gets excited by what he sees and says, I gotta bring this to the folks back home.
Alongside Jonas Mekas, advocate of underground cinema, Sarris wrote in the 60s for the Village Voice. It was there that he tried out his new aesthetic, on Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho.
I saw it without any warning. I saw it the first day of its release. I was still living with my mother in Queens, and I was very susceptible to that maternal figure looming in the doorway with a big knife. And I screamed. I literally screamed. It really scared the hell out of me. But then when I sat down to write it, I was aware that Hitchcock had been reevaluated in France.
In line with French critics, Sarris claimed that Hitchcock was a metaphysical artist, an auteur.
He insists upon a moral reckoning for his characters and for his audience.
The bathroom.
We can violate the commandments at our own psychic peril, but we must pay the price in guilt at the end.
Supporting the auteur theory, Sarris brought undervalued American directors into the light. John Ford, Howard Hawks, the long-deceased D.W. Griffith.
With his book, The American Cinema, Sarris provided a way to approach American film, to look at it through the eyes of the director, through the eyes of the auteur theory.
I knew the American Cinema. I practically had memorized it when I was in college. Just used to refer to it as the book.
He actually made obvious points, but true points, about how certain directors are really good, and you can actually see what's good about them, and that they have certain themes that work over and over again.
Can we conclude that in the United States, the auteur theory is an attempt by adult males to justify staying inside the small range of experience of their boyhood and adolescence?
The author of this attack on Sarris was a shoot-from-the-hip Californian who'd run an art house cinema in Berkeley, Pauline Kael. She called the auteur theory silly, dangerous, anti-art.
I didn't know anything about her. She was off in San Francisco, and she sounded to me very bitchy, very tough.
What she is a sniper. She's a master of insult humor. And when she tore apart Andrew Sarris in Circles and Squares, one of the reasons it was effective, although it's wrong-headed, it's because it was so funny.
It may be a very nice time for you, Andy, to admit that you no longer subscribe to the auteur theory.
No. I always thought my life would be like a movie, and I'd walk in and there would be Katharine Hepburn adjusting her stocking, and I get a flash of her beautiful legs. And that would be the beginning of a beautiful romance. And that situation actually presented itself because Pauline called me. I was a little startled that she called me, you know, because I'd read her attack on me. It hadn't been published yet, but I'd read it. She wanted to meet me. You know, I said, well, I don't know. And she said, won't your lover let you come? She was still clinging to this homophobic interpretation of auteurism. The auteurs were all, you know, I don't know, little sissies. And I thought that was very nervy, so I said, sure, I can come there. But, you know, I took one look at Pauline, and she was not Catherine Hepburn. You never stop to think what you look like, you know, when you have these fantasies. You were not Spencer Tracy either. Actually, I married a beautiful girl, but that's just luck on my part.
There's one thing that Cale and Saris agreed upon, and so did younger critics. It was that Bosley Crowther, still at the New York Times since the 40s, felt increasingly out of touch.
He really didn't know what to make of the French films when they started coming out with Godard and Truffaut. He was upset. He was sort of morally shocked by them.
From my vantage point as a small magazine critic, hothouse critic, whatever, he was the enemy.
It really worked in that movie in the sense of, you know, those funny cars bucketing across the plain, the whole notion of Clyde's impotence, and as he becomes handier with a gun, his potency kind of revives. Bosley Crowther just utterly savaged this movie in the New York Times. He thought it was immoral because it sort of celebrated gangsters.
This blending of farce with brutal killings is as pointless as it is lacking in taste.
There was an enormous amount of restiveness at the Times with him. They were tired of apologizing for him.
At the same time, a much-read freelance essay in The New Yorker boosted the career of Pauline Kael.
The ragdoll dance of death as the gun blasts keep the bodies of Bonnie and Clyde in motion is brilliant. It is a horror that seems to go on for eternity, and yet it doesn't last a second beyond what it should. Bonnie and Clyde has put the sting back into death.
In late 1967, Crowther was retired by the Times. That's when The New Yorker hired its new film critic.
You know, we've always taken high culture very, very seriously, but we haven't taken popular culture that seriously. And in recent years, we've begun to understand that perhaps popular culture affected people even more deeply than high culture.
Most of the movies that I watched were on television, certainly when I was little, and I remember The Boy with Green Hair, Joseph Losey. I watched this with my brother. Even thinking about it now, it really kind of spooks me out. A kid who wakes up one morning and his hair has turned green.
Hey, Gramp!
Right, lad?
I've got green hair.
Here is this kid who is not from outer space. He is a regular kid. He's like me. I could wake up the next morning with green hair.
They want me to cut my hair off.
My brother and I still, to this day, can call each other up on the phone and say, I won't cut it off and I won't dye it. It still clenches my stomach when I think about it. It was fantastically frightening.
I wasn't a film geek. I wasn't somebody who grew up, watching all of the old movies on TV. I wasn't somebody who grew up, hanging around, the film houses. I was reading books then.
I was constantly at the movies, constantly at film societies, revival houses, but I didn't attempt to write criticism. I wanted to be a fiction writer.
I wrote a couple of reviews at the age of 12 of North by Northwest and Hole in the Head that I submitted to the local paper, and they wouldn't print the reviews because they said, well, we can't have a movie reviewer because what if you dislike a movie? Then the advertisers will get mad.
I think there are two ways you can get into film criticism. One is that you have always wanted to do it, grown up reading it, grown up thinking that's the thing to do, or you've done everything else before. I'm in the everything else before camp. I was always a journalist, I was always writing, but I started actually writing about classical music. I was a violist and I was a pianist.
I knew a lot of people, a lot of black people, who read film criticism, who read film criticism, who go to the movies. It's shocking, but we do. And there wasn't anybody, any black person really writing about it. And that was one of the reasons I wanted to do this, was to sort of prove that there was a place for black people in it. It was kind of as simple as that.
In the late 60s and early 70s, being a film critic meant writing against the background of the war in Vietnam.
Film criticism and the film critics were all involved in this ferment, and this turbulence, and this chaos of the times, and in the passion of the times, because people really, really cared about things. That's one thing the Vietnam War did. It really focused everybody's energies.
Back Bay, main line. Mayor's press conference, best bologna in town. You eat it.
From Chicago to LA to San Francisco to Boston, anti-war opposition spread the growth of alternative weeklies.
I'd like you to start considering sending me to France to cover the Cannes Film Festival. I think it'd be a very prestigious thing for the paper.
Every weekly had an ambitious film reviewer who got lots of space to write politically, analytically, personally. Boston, home of legendary art houses, managed 2 weeklies.
A lot of really great film critics came out of Boston. It was almost a kind of unofficial postgraduate program.
It's obviously a good place for critics to start. Owen Gleiberman was here, Lisa Schwartzbaum was here, and David Thompson was here.
David Denby, Janet Maslin, David Anson. There was a tremendous excitement about film in Boston. It was just one of those places that had a magical combination of great revival theaters, a terrific alternative press, and all these colleges, which were the natural breeding ground for film buffs.
Meanwhile, in New York, Vincent Canby became the Times' first-string critic.
The worst thing you can ask critics when they come out of a screening is, what'd you think? What'd you think? Because I don't think that I know what I think until I'm writing.
Canby was the most powerful film critic in the United States for a period of a quarter of a century. Canby was the make-or-break critic.
Canby had such effortless style and grace. The touch was always right. You always felt like he found the right tone.
Andreas Winkelmann is repairing the roof of the cottage in which he lives. He stares off at the sun that hangs low and dim in the Scandinavian sky. The sun disappears into the gray-blue haze, but it's as if Andreas had willed it invisible, much as he tried to will himself invisible. With this lovely image, Ingmar Bergman begins The Passion of Anna.
Whether it was Fellini, or it was Bergman, or it was Truffaut, or it was Kurosawa. It was fun to be a movie reviewer then, because those were defining movie moments for a reviewer or for the serious audience.
I would get into a taxi and the taxi driver would really want to argue about a review I had written, or would tell me, my wife doesn't make a single decision about going to the movies until she knows what you think about it. And I really had access to a huge audience then.
It was an example of the magic of movies, how seriously films were taken at that time, and of the power of film critics to shape that debate.
This was a time when the women's movement was also coming to the fore, and I was excited about that. So I began sort of seeing things sort of dually, both as a film lover and film scholar and as a feminist.
Molly Haskell, to women like me, was this kind of mysterious goddess, gorgeous, smart, living the intellectual life.
Haskell was among critics championing women film directors.
The trouble with most of the women's films now is that they're programmatic. They tell us how women should feel, but they don't explore the real sexual tensions.
For Cale, feminism was too narrow a prism for the exploding American cinema.
I hope that men will not give up exploring their fantasies, because that's one of the most fertile fields in movies.
Alienating politically conscious women, Cale praised the most good fella filmmakers: Peckinpah, Altman, Scorsese, Coppola.
A movie like The Godfather, a movie like Mean Streets, these movies, they are really brilliant works.
Pauline Kael of The New Yorker called it a triumph of personal filmmaking.
I'll give her credit. She was the first one who picked up on Scorsese for Mean Streets. I was not overwhelmed by Mean Streets. She picked up on good things about Brian De Palma and a lot of other people.
And what's it like going to the movies with Pauline Kael?
Well, it's absolutely fine. She kind of sits there and scribbles little notes on the paper, you know, which of course I disapprove of completely as a filmmaker. I mean, I think the critics should come and see the movie and just sort of let it wash over them.
Kael, who had started out bashing auteurism, became, you know, in a way, the greatest auteurist of all. She just had a different bunch of auteurs.
Pauline was an incredible auteurist. I mean, all you have to do is read her rave reviews of Brian De Palma one after another to realize that she could totally see movies through that lens.
Cale fueled the old Saris rivalry. She looked for critics to support her way of seeing cinema, her directors rather than his.
And I sent her the review, about 4 or 5 of them, and I remember this amazing 2-page handwritten letter she sent me back, going on a length of it, what she liked about the reviews, and offering, and she didn't know me from Adam, offering me any support that she could give me.
And Pauline helped me get my first job at the Boston Phoenix in 1981. You felt like she was this great writer, and why was she so concerned about you? And of course the answer turned out to be very complex. I mean, she may have admired your writing, but what you may have not been so aware of is that you were potentially being lined up as one of her recruits.
Almost every critic I know at one point or another, if they made it and she hadn't decided she hated them in advance, got a telephone call from Pauline Kael where she'd said that she liked their work and she actually befriended them and guided them.
And so, considering this ecclesiastical tone that some of her acolytes took, I created the term Paulette.
The so-called Paulettes versus the Sarisites.
He brought in sort of film buff writers that hadn't had any social life of any kind, or any sexual or social life, which was a lot of what film buffdom was in those days.
The first time I was at the meeting of the National Society of Film Critics, I walked into the room as this guy from LA who basically didn't know any famous critics. And on one half of the room were all the people who I knew were Paulettes. And on the other half of the room, sort of around Saris, but just like the non-Paulettes, basically had to choose side. Where in the table are you going to sit?
Pauline was Dionysian. Andy was Apollonian. He wanted to make the claim for movies that they were just like books, like literature. So let's study them. Let's catalog these directors. Kael hated all that. She wanted to treat movies in a way that was as free, as spontaneous, and alive, and playful as movies themselves.
As with so many intellectual arguments, the fight between Andrew Saris and Pauline Kael is essentially about power. You know, and it's imposing a vision of the world that in fact is not a very precise vision of the world, but it's their vision of the world.
Some critics like to see a movie several times. I see it once, and also because I don't really want to see it again before the writing.
I don't believe her entirely, but she has said that she never sees a film more than once.
I can remember the details, and in the act of writing, I fix a movie very clearly in my mind, so that I enjoy writing about it from that first experience.
I find that almost masochistic, you know. If I love a film, I can't wait to see it again. I don't understand that attitude, or that she never changes her verdict once it's rendered. We made each other. We helped each other. We established an opposition, a dialectic.
And that's the only way you can really be an honest critic in any form. Because
anyway,
the pressures
it turns out that much of the time we were very close. For instance, we both share a kind of centrist political position. We've both been politically incorrect on occasion. It's just a personal thing. It's just the way it worked out.
Years later, the New Yorker critic job is split between David Denby and Anthony Lane. But Cale's debates with Saris still resonate.
What's interesting, probably more than almost anything else in American cultural life, is it played itself out over 20 or 30 years and radically shaped the way people wrote about and thought about movies.
Mourned by her followers and even her detractors, Pauline Kael died in 2001.
There are lots of people who write like her. People who are in her orbit and still carry parts of her away with them.
So ever since the Iliad, we believe that the fall of an enemy is a tragic rather than a comic event, you know, and that's the way I feel about Pauline.
The first movie that really scared me, I felt like for a long time I had dreamed it. I would tell people about it. There's no such movie. And it was really bloody. That's the other thing I remember about it, because movies weren't bloody in those days for the most part. It started with these two couples in this car, this big convertible Chevy, going to this picnic. The couples are separated by these sort of seductive country folk. And as they're sort of taking off these various events, this guy is sort of persuading to getting to this barrel for the barrel roll. They seal the barrel up, drive spikes into it, and roll it down the hill. Meanwhile, these two rednecks walking around singing, you know, and playing banjo and a guitar and singing about it. And I finally found this movie. It was Herschel Gordon Lewis's 2000 Maniacs. So it did exist. There's a whole world of movies that existed, you know, grade B, they prayed to be called grade B. I remember seeing one called The Black Six and being at Scream, Blackula, Scream. Maybe one of the things that has me doing this now is that I just want a chance to kind of write about that experience, how that formed me, how that formed what could laughingly be called my sensibility.
Yes. I tried the other theory about how you should be involved with somebody who has no relationship to movies, and I got divorced.
It's slightly easier if the woman I've been involved with is interested in film. But in fact, it's not a whole lot easier, because in fact, the demands of being a film critic are often that you're going to see so much stuff that even a woman who loves movies wouldn't dream of wanting to go see that 300th movie that you yourself know in advance isn't going to be very good, but it's your job to go anyway.
My significant other is indeed a film historian, and one of my favorite things to do is go to the movies with him and then blab on about it into the wee hours afterwards.
All of my closest friends have lives that have something to do other than with the movies. It's nice to be able to have conversations that are esoteric, but it's more important to have smart, interesting friends. And by the way, they should like to hike.
In 1975, an enterprising television show debuted in Chicago. It was a program devoted to film criticism.
The name of our show is Opening Soon at a Theater Near You. Two film critics talking about the movies, and this is Roger Ebert, the film critic from the Chicago Sun-Times.
And right over here is Gene Siskel, the film critic from the Chicago Tribune and Channel 2 News.
The point of our show is to sort of be a news magazine about movies.
A lot of people watching this show saw for the first time people who took the movies seriously,
who disagreed about them, who had arguments, who defended their arguments. That was very useful for the audience.
If Mr. McMurphy doesn't want to take his medication orally, I'm sure we can arrange that he can have it some other way.
Louise Fletcher brings another component to the film completely. She has sort of a sexual attraction to Nicholson, so you really don't know any kind of direction and way the film's going to go. So I thought her performance surprised me and was one of the pleasant surprises in the film.
It's a little bit of a disappointing film, I think. It wasn't quite the overwhelming experience that I'd expected, and I think one of the problems... You have two guys fighting about the movies, and Gene brought a real tension onto the set. He played to win. He wanted his opinion to be listened to, and he wanted people to think that he was right. And of course, I felt exactly the same way. And it created a kind of a genuine chemistry that I think people did relate to.
Well, the Ebert-Siskel show is very important for kind of establishing the romance of movie criticism. They were the first movie critics who became sort of big TV celebrities, and became TV celebrities because they were movie critics.
It was in 1975 with Jaws that Hollywood realized the value of TV to launch its marketing campaign.
It will attack and devour anything.
Crowds lined up the opening day, enticed there by Universal Pictures' half-minute ads on primetime programming.
Jaws. See it before you go swimming.
And magazine cover stories became part of the advertising. 2 years later, Star Wars, the mega hit of mega hits. The reviews were favorable, but who cared what critics said? Rabid fans claimed it as their own, becoming Star Wars experts, walking advertisements. Their obsession qualified fans to make judgment on the film, not critics. Teenagers became the objects of TV ad campaigns, which lured them to the theaters for adolescent comedies and slasher movies.
Friday the 13th.
The average level of Hollywood films went down a shocking amount in the 1980s. They had younger executives who believed that their job was just to appeal to a very young, basically teenage crowd. I think their ideal viewer during most of that period was a 15-year-old male in a shopping mall.
The auteurs preferred now were those who made lots of money. Lucas and Spielberg, especially combined with bankable stars like Harrison Ford. But outside of Hollywood, reviewers in the 80s and 90s found a new calling, supporting independent American cinema.
It really was an independent film revolution. It's very real. It's produced a lot of great films, a lot of great filmmakers, and, not so incidentally, a lot of great criticism.
Even the New York Times embraced the independents.
It's Marge who is this film's idea of a folk hero, seriously pregnant, wearing a hat with ear flaps, toddling intrepidly through the snow to investigate grisly crime scenes. Marge is this film's ace detective, as well as its moral center.
In 1993, Vincent Canby retired as the Times' first-string reviewer. Janet Maslin took over and stayed on until the new millennium.
The chief film critic of the newspaper of record was Janet Maslin, a woman. I liked her writing, I liked her graciousness.
While print critics concentrated on theatrical releases, thousands of old movies piled up at the video store. This extraordinary invention had transformed the way films were made available to an audience.
As people were taking these movies and watching them in their homes, it was probably less necessary for them to have a dialogue with a critic.
In the 90s, young film buffs went on their own, writing for their own in amateur fanzines, guides for what to see on video. The reviewers weren't Cale and Canby. They were kids, Max and Andrew. A startling new concept. Everyone's a critic.
The first movie I ever saw is also the first movie that Steven Spielberg says he saw. Maybe a lot of people our age saw this movie. The Greatest Show on Earth, Cecil B. DeMille. I went to see it with my mom, and there's a scene where the circus train derails. And all the animals escape. The animals are free, you know, yeah. And, you know, I never wanted to see this movie again because I have this very clear, you know, 3.5-year-old, 4-year-old's memory of that scene. I don't want to lose it.
I saw Titanic at a press screening on the lot at Paramount in a very big theater with a very huge screen, a lot of journalists there. And I was kind of actually mixed about it when I saw it. Jim Cameron is a brilliant craftsman. I felt that the script was lacking.
Why can't I be like you, Jack? Just head out for the horizon whenever I feel like it.
He really thinks she was there.
Oh, yeah. I'm a believer.
I got a phone call from my editor saying we've gotten, you know, a long letter has just come in from James Cameron. He's faxing it over. And he basically is calling for the paper to fire you.
There's always been a history of animus between critics in Hollywood.
You're certainly not enjoying yourself.
No, as a matter of fact, I'm not. Oh, it has nothing to do with you, darling. No, it's that review that Blair wrote on our last picture. Have you seen it?
Yes, darling, but those things are written about everybody. You shouldn't pay any attention to them.
Well, I don't as a general thing, but this guy's gone out of his way to be nasty. Here, get his first line. From slum-dum to stardom.
There's definitely a tension that you have between the machine that cranks out the product and the people who are responsible for interpreting its meaning.
You wrote this review yourself, didn't you?
Certainly. My name's on it.
Open your mouth. Open! Now chew.
They're very assertive, sometimes aggressive, very usually intellectual, very heady kind of philosophical people who I think believe that their weight is worth more than it is.
Now, I know some people found this movie fun, but me, I'd rather spend 2 hours having root canal work done. What's fun about a movie full of ugly, slimy, mean-spirited, gloppy little monsters who run amok and attack innocent people? Our moviegoers so desperate for entertainment, desperate for trash, and pass for fun. Whoa, wait a minute!
There's no way you can win answering your critics. I think with all reviews, I read the good ones once, the bad ones twice, and put them away and never look at them again.
They all think they can make better movies than the people who make movies. And this is what drives the people who make movies crazy.
No matter how much people may have disagreed with what I felt about the film, people were less comfortable with the director kind of running film criticism. You know, people liked the idea of an independent voice, and they didn't want Jim Cameron having a say in who the film critic was. So it's interesting that his attack on me got me an enormous amount of support, whereas my original review had gotten me a lot of hostile mail.
What I see of internet reviewing is people just surpassing ignorance about the medium, expressing themselves on the medium.
Nobody's quite accountable for what they're writing.
I'm computer illiterate at the moment. I say at the moment, probably till I die. I understand a lot of my stuff is on the web, but I just don't look at it.
As fanzine writers went digital in the late 90s, their opinions moved with them onto the internet. Movie websites flooded the internet. They promised everything. A streaming theme park for those who logged in.
You have a screening room. You can actually look at movie clips up there.
We have a lot of feature film trailers and clips from popular films.
So it's previews, coming attractions.
Exactly.
And we also have interesting chat rooms where people really get into it about why they like or don't like a movie.
Exactly.
Quickly, some websites claim far more allegiance than traditional print critics.
I'm at 2.5 million readers a day and 6 million different viewers over the course of a month. I've got readers in every country on the planet.
In 1997, Harry Knowles started a film reviewing website in his Austin, Texas bedroom. It featured Harry's raw, unrevised, stream of consciousness typings.
He's more of a clearinghouse than a critic. More of a, we had trouble finding a parking space, and then I ate 3 chili dogs, and my dad saved a seat for me, and I saw this girl, and then after a while the movie started, and so forth, which is a valid approach.
Knowles spoke especially to young people with similar aesthetics.
You've had filmmakers like Michael Bay, which old guard film critics despise. To a younger generation of film critics, it's not erratic, nonsensical editing. They can see where he's going. It's going so fast, I don't think he held on a shot in Armageddon for longer than 2 seconds. When you had films like Fight Club, a straight divisional shift in terms of generation. The older film critics thought that it was nonsensical that you need violent conflict to become a man. This new generation saw the movie as an experience.
But he was certainly the person who galvanized the revolution of sort of do-it-yourself criticism or sort of untrained critics or just average movie fans writing about the movies they were seeing.
Knowles was the first web critic noticed by the studios. He was flown to Hollywood for a private look at new films.
For whatever reasons, the studios now feel that I'm an important piece in the advanced buzz of a film.
Other internet critics followed. They joined a long-time Hollywood tradition for smaller media, the press junket.
The studios have to get people into movies, and they have to get people into movies on the first weekend.
I'm here for the junkets for Miramax, Fox, and I think Warner Brothers.
What they need to do is to give an unambiguous, unadulterated message that this film will be one of the greatest experiences you've had in your life. There really aren't all that many legitimate critics who will tell you that. Find critics who love to take trips, who are thrilled to be in 5-star hotels, and who will put their name on some hyperbolic description of a movie. And that's exactly how it happens.
Before the New York critics see a film, they've already got quote ads made up from people who nobody has ever heard of, who pounce on the buffet table, see the movie, and give them a quote on their way out the door.
Riveting, Swampscott Shopper, best film of Barbra Streisand's career, Venice Beach supermarket throwaway. And you wonder, why don't they have the New York Times or the Los Angeles Times or National Public Radio or the Boston Phoenix in here? First of all, the critics probably don't like those movies. Secondly, this is an audience that, for them, any film critic is a film critic.
I've been quoted in AI, The Rat Race, Cats and Dogs, Scary Movie 2.
The internet has made the proliferation of these people possible in a way that it never was before.
Friends of mine say, oh yeah, Cats and Dogs, funnier than Babe. Well, you know, I didn't think Babe was a funny movie. It was a charming movie, and I didn't say Cats and Dogs was better than Babe. I said it was funnier.
The critics are considered enemies by most film companies. They don't even want us to see the films. They don't care whether we show up or not.
If you like movies and you go to movies and you can sensibly put down how you feel about the movies in print and explain it, you don't need any qualifications to be a film critic.
Makes you wonder, why am I doing all of this, you know?
It's an internet world. Log in, look around, and there are critics on the net for everybody and for every movie interest.
There is no longer a monolithic popular culture. Everybody doesn't listen to the Beatles' White Album anymore. Everybody doesn't read the New York Times anymore. I don't think that somebody, just because somebody's writing on a website, it makes them any less valid than somebody else. Because what starts to happen with criticism after a while, you do it regularly enough, you build an audience.
I'm inspired by the fact that the web has provided so many outlets for so many really good writers. And if you go online, you can see young people who give you a lot of faith in the future.
They've been cruising on the internet longer than I have.
So they're actually able to guide us older people into all sorts of resources there. And I think that's very exciting, to become part of that community, and a very interactive community.
Deep in the new millennium, traditional media are still there, but more digital by the day, because that's where their readers are going.
You don't need the presses anymore. You have the internet, and any writer has the potential of having 50 million readers.
A lot of people that I know do read print reviews, but we read them online. I have an RSS feed of the New York Times film review section, and so I read every review that's printed in the New York Times, but I never buy the newspaper.
Eagle vs. Shark is an oddball romantic comedy directed by Taika Cohen. It's a little bit like a New Zealand version of Napoleon Dynamite. It tells the story.
The Times' A.O. Scott was among the first print critics to do podcasts. There's more. Blogging is a required part of a print critic's job. For the first time with blogs, fans can directly challenge a critic, back and forth.
What I say is just the start of a conversation. John Reader, he could write a comment on my review, and he knows that I'm going to read it. And he can start a discussion with other readers right there with the review as a reference.
The thing that critics have been saying for years that differentiates them from, quote, the masses, was that they had critical thought. If everyone can become a critic, then that means critical thinking is spread.
But the democracy of reviewing can mean a backlash against veteran critics, those who favor movies which played decades ago.
The DeMille uses hordes of real people. He has an actual cast of thousands.
It is the breath of God!
Nowadays, CGI and Gladiator, of course, half the Coliseum and most of the people don't exist. They're created in the computer.
There's something very weird about being 60 years old in the current film climate and spending your life writing about things that are so oriented toward the mass and that you just can't relate to.
There are several print critics who are excellent writers and excellent film critics, but by and large, they seem to get a little jaded and a little spoiled and a little just sick of film. And you know, it's like if a teacher gets sick of being a teacher, I don't want him teaching my children.
In an effort to stay current, mainstream media started hiring younger and younger talent.
Why is ageism acceptable in the print media and in the electronic media? Because there's so many younger people that want to get ahead that it's just easy to dump on older critics and say, you're out of touch with the audience, you should hang it up.
In 2007, the Chicago Tribune replaced Michael Wilmington with a more youthful presence.
I have a question for you. What the hell is up with the comic book movies this summer?
Every editor I know is actually looking for the smart, hot young critic because it allows you to fire the expensive 60-year-old critic and reach the youthful demographic.
But these days, longtime print media are in economic trouble, losing readers, pages, advertisers. Some see an end to a calling, as newly hired critics are often the first to be fired, joining veteran reviewers among the non-employed.
Behold, the future of film criticism. I'm Jamie Bernard. I've been a film critic for 20 years, most recently for the New York Daily News. I'm also an author. It's not like I don't have any projects. A year and a half after I stopped being a film critic, I started my own business, and no one's the boss of me.
Those who once held print jobs must reinvent themselves online.
There's so much of it out there now. I mean, there's a lot more to choose from. There was a time when there was just like, Mount Rushmore. There was Pauline and Vincent Canby and Andrew Saris and a handful of people who were really important.
Critics don't have authority anymore at all. I can say this as somebody who writes criticism. I have a master's degree in cinema studies. At the same time, I'm no more qualified to blog than a teenager in Vermont who's still in high school.
I'm not looking for the people behind me for hope or from my generation. I'm looking for the new kids who are coming up, who are not bound by these rules. I'm looking for the next theory that's going to come after the auteur theory. I'm looking for the next way of making sense of cinema.
Film critics, young and old, amateur and professional, now coexist in cyberspace.
I mean, what's great about film criticism is creating like a dialogue about a film, and like actually, like I think that legitimizes making films.
Critics have been fair to me. I think I've been fairly treated. I've been understood. I'm certainly not misunderstood what I've been trying to do.
It's interesting to read when someone's seen the film several times and putting it together in an interesting way and has interesting things to say. I mean, you can smell it like one paragraph in if they have a sense of the history of cinema, if they're tying it, into, the history of the genre you're operating in or your own previous work or all that.
All one has to do is look year after year after year and see all the different films that, when the year began, were very low or not even on the radar, and then watch what happened when critics start championing films, whether they be Boys Don't Cry or Crouching Tiger.
It's hugely important to me, the reviews. I'm extremely insecure and constantly question whether I should be making films, and always feeling that there's, better filmmakers out there. Getting positive feedback, is really important in terms of giving me confidence to go on and continue.
Film critics, they've seen a lot of movies. They know what you're up to, and they can point it out in actually a pretty productive way. So I think I've been very lucky to have any harsh criticism that's been directed at me, and there has been some I think I've basically agreed with in the end.
It's the annual dinner of the New York Film Critics, and industry professionals join the toast.
Dave Kerr from www.cinematográfica. Lisa Schwartzbaum from Entertainment Weekly. A.O. Tony Scott from the New York Times.
Some people might find it a bit odd that the people who judge movies and evaluate movies all year round want to get together in a big room full of movie people, but basically we're all playing the same game. I think that those people who are responsible people in the industry and those of us who are responsible commentators on the industry, we all want to make the movies better.
The only hope we had of this not being a very, very expensive tree that fell in the forest with no one there to hear it was if people who wrote about film wrote about this one. This relationship between those who think and write about film and those who make it, is a necessary one, and I think it's been proved right here. Thanks. Thank you.
The times that film criticism has influenced filmmaking, that doesn't matter. What does matter, I think, is that good filmmakers are happy that they exist in a culture in which good criticism exists.
If you give people an expansive world of all cinema, all movies, if you include the movies they love and then show them the movies they could love, if they just expanded their vision a little, then I think you're performing the service. At least you're performing the service that I've always wanted to as a critic.
My advice to kids who are coming through when they all, journalism kids who come through and say, how do I get to be you? Is say, do everything else first. See the world, write about other stuff, have some life, wander around, take the wrong direction, keep going to the movies, have some experience, read books, watch television, go hiking, do all of that so that when you finally do get to write about films, if that's what you still really, really want to do, you have a perspective with which to do it.
The only way I can get people to read me, I believe, is to write as good a review as I can. And hopefully the quality of the review will make people want to read it. That's all I can do.
I'm not a professional. I'm an amateur in the French sense of someone who is engaged in something for the love of it. And I'd rather do this than anything else in the world.
Telephone rang, I picked it up. The reader said, we live near the Wilmette Theater and they're playing Cries and Whispers. What can you tell me about it? And I said, oh, I think that's the year's best film. And the reader said, oh, that doesn't sound like anything we'd like to see. Now, how can you account for that? I mean, that's human nature.
Let us pause in life's pleasures and count its many tears, while we all sob sorrow with the poor. There's a song that will linger forever in our ears. Oh, hard time, come again no more. As we seek earth and beauty and the music light and day, there are frail forms fainting by the door. Though their voices may be silent, their pleading looks will stay. Oh, hard time, come again no more. 'Tis a song, the sigh of the weary. Hard time, come again no more. Many days you have lingered all around my door. Hard